An astronaut or cosmonaut is a person trained by a human spaceflight program to command, pilot, or serve as a crew member of a spacecraft. Although generally reserved for professional space travelers, the terms are sometimes applied to anyone who travels into space, including scientists, politicians, journalists, and tourists. Starting in the 1950s up to 2002, astronauts were sponsored and trained exclusively by governments, either by the military or by civilian space agencies, with the suborbital flight of the privately funded spaceship ONE in 2004, a new category of astronaut was created, the commercial astronaut. Definition. The criteria for what constitutes human spaceflight vary. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale Sporting Code for Astronautics recognizes only flights that exceed an altitude of 100 kilometers. In the United States, professional, military, and commercial astronauts who travel above an altitude of 50 miles are awarded astronaut wings. As of 8 June 2013, update, a total of 532 people from 36 countries have reached 100 kilometers or more in altitude, of which 529 reached low Earth orbit or beyond. Of these, 24 people have traveled beyond low Earth orbit, to either lunar or trans-lunar orbit or to the surface of the Moon. 3 of the 24 did so twice. Jim Lovell, John Young and Eugene Cernan. The 3 astronauts who have not reached low Earth orbit are spaceplane pilots Joe Walker, Mike Melville, and Brian Binney. As of 20 June 2011, update, under the U.S. definition 538 people qualify as having reached space, above 50 miles altitude. Of 8x15 pilots who exceeded 50 miles in altitude, only one exceeded 100 kilometers. Space travelers have spent over 41,790 man-days in space, including over 100 astronaut days of spacewalks. As of 2008, the man with the longest cumulative time in space is Sergei K. Krikalev, who has spent 803 days, 9 hours and 39 minutes, or 2.2 years, in space. Peggy A. Whitson holds the record for the most time in space by a woman, 377 days. Terminology. In 1959, when both the United States and Soviet Union were planning, but had yet to launch humans into space, NASA Administrator T. Keith Glennon and his Deputy Administrator, Dr. Hugh Dryden, discussed whether spacecraft crew members should be called astronauts or cosmonauts. Dryden preferred cosmonaut on the grounds that flights would occur in the cosmos, while the astro prefix suggested flight to the stars. Most NASA Space Task Group members preferred astronaut, which survived by common usage as the preferred American term. When the Soviet Union launched the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, in 1961, they chose a term which anglicizes to cosmonaut. English. In English-speaking nations, a professional space traveler is called an astronaut. The term derives from the Greek words astron, meaning star, and nautes, meaning sailor. The first known use of the term astronaut in the modern sense was by Neil R. Jones in his short story, The Death's Head Meteor, in 1930. The word itself had been known earlier. For example, in Percy Gregg's 1880 book Across the Zodiac, astronaut referred to a spacecraft. In Les Navigateurs de l'Infini of J.H. Rosny-Acute, the word astronautique was used. The word may have been inspired by aeronaut, an older term for an air traveler first applied to balloonists. An early use in a non-fiction publication is Eric Frank Russell's poem, The Astronaut, in the November 1934 Bulletin of the British Interplanetary Society. The first known formal use of the term astronautics in the scientific community was the establishment of the annual International Astronautical Congress in 1950 and the subsequent founding of the International Astronautical Federation the following year. NASA applies the term astronaut to any crew member aboard NASA spacecraft bound for Earth orbit or beyond. NASA also uses the term as a title for those selected to join its astronaut corps. The European Space Agency similarly uses the term astronaut for members of its astronaut corps. Russian by convention, an astronaut employed by the Russian Federal Space Agency is called a cosmonaut in English texts. The word is an anglicization of the Russian word cosmonaut, one who works in space outside the Earth's atmosphere, a space traveler, which derives from the Greek words kosmos, meaning universe, and nauts, meaning sailor. Other countries of the former Eastern Bloc use variations of the Russian word cosmonaut, such as the Polish kosmonauta. The first cosmonaut was Soviet Air Force pilot Yuri Gagarin, also the first person in space. Valentina Tereshkova, a Russian factory worker, was the first woman in space, as well as the first civilian among the Soviet cosmonaut or NASA astronaut corps to make a space flight. On March 14, 1995, Norman Thagard became the first American to ride to space on board a Russian launch vehicle, and thus became the first American cosmonaut. Chinese official English-language texts issued by the government of China use astronaut, while texts in Russian use. In official Chinese-language texts, Yuhan Yuan is used for astronauts and cosmonauts, and Hang Tian Yuan is used for Chinese astronauts. The phrase Taikong Req10 is often used in Hong Kong and Taiwan. The term taikonaut is used by some English-language news media organizations for professional space travelers from China. The word has featured in the Longman and Oxford English dictionaries, the latter of which describes it as a hybrid of the Chinese term taikong and the Greek naut. The term became more common in 2003 when China sent its first astronaut Zhang Liwei into space aboard the Shenzhou 5 spacecraft. This is the term used by Xinhua News Agency in the English version of the Chinese People's Daily since the advent of the Chinese space program. The origin of the term is unclear. As early as May 1998, Chuli Yih from Malaysia used it in news groups. Other terms with the rise of space tourism. NASA and the Russian Federal Space Agency agreed to use the term spaceflight participant to distinguish those space travelers from professional astronauts on missions coordinated by those two agencies. While no nation other than the Russian Federation, the United States, and China have launched a manned spacecraft, several other nations have sent people into space in cooperation with one of these countries. Inspired partly by these missions, other synonyms for astronaut have entered occasional English usage. For example, the term spacenaut is sometimes used to describe French space travelers, from the Latin word spatium for space. The Malay term Angkasawan was used to describe participants in the Angkasawan program, and the Indian Space Research Organisation hoped to launch a spacecraft in 2018 that would carry Vyomanauts, coined from the Sanskrit word for space. Space travel milestones. The first human in space was Soviet Yuri Gagarin, who was launched on April 12, 1961 aboard Vostok 1 and orbited around the Earth for 108 minutes. The first woman in space was Soviet Valentina Tereshkova, who launched on June 16, 1963 aboard Vostok 6 and orbited Earth for almost 3 days. Alan Shepard became the first American and second person in space on May 5, 1961 on a 15-minute suborbital flight. The first American woman in space was Sally Ride, during Space Shuttle Challenger's mission STS-7, on June 18, 1983. In 1992 Mae Jemison became the first African American woman to travel in space aboard STS-47. Cosmonaut Alexei Leonov was the first person to conduct an extravehicular activity, on March 18, 1965, on the Soviet Union's Voskhod 2 mission. This was followed 2.5 months later by astronaut Ed White, who made the first American EVA on NASA's Gemini 4 mission. The first manned mission to orbit the Moon, Apollo 8, included American William Anders, who was born in Hong Kong, making him the first Asian-born astronaut in 1968. The Soviet Union, through its Interkosmos program, allowed people from other socialist countries to fly on its missions, with the notable exception of France participating in Soyuz Trademark 7. An example is Czechoslovak Vladimir Remek, the first cosmonaut from a country other than the Soviet Union or the United States, who flew to space in 1978 on a Soyuz U rocket. On July 23, 1980, Pham Tuan of Vietnam became the first Asian in space when he flew aboard Soyuz 37. Also in 1980, Cuban Arnaldo Tamayo Mende became the first person of Hispanic and Black African descent to fly in space, and in 1983, Guyon Bluford became the first African American to fly into space. In April 1985, Taylor Wang became the first ethnic Chinese person in space. The first person born in Africa to fly in space was Patrick Baudry, in 1985. In 1985, Saudi Arabian Prince Sultan bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud became the first Arab Muslim astronaut in space. In 1988, Abdul Ahad Momand became the first Afghan to reach space, spending 9 days aboard the Mir space station. With a larger number of seats available on the Space Shuttle, the U.S. began taking international astronauts. In 1983, Ulf Merbold of West Germany became the first non-U.S. citizen to fly in a U.S. spacecraft. In 1984, Mark Garneau became the first of 8 Canadian astronauts to fly in space. In 1985, Rodolfo Neri Vela became the first Mexican-born person in space. In 1991, Helen Sharman became the first Briton to fly in space. In 2002, Mark Shuttleworth became the first citizen of an African country to fly in space, as a paying spaceflight participant. In 2003, Ilan Ramon became the first Israeli to fly in space, although he died during a re-entry accident. On October 15, 2003, Zhang Liwei became China's first astronaut on the Shenzhou 5 spacecraft. Age milestones: the youngest person to fly in space is German Tito, who was 25 years old when he flew Vostok 2. The oldest person who has flown in space is John Glenn, who was 77 when he flew on STS-95. Duration and distance milestones: the longest stay in space thus far has been 438 days, by Russian Valery Polyakov. As of 2006, the most space flights by an individual astronaut is 7, a record held by both Jerry L. Ross and Franklin Chang Diaz. The farthest distance from Earth an astronaut has traveled was 401,056 kilometers, when Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes went around the Moon during the Apollo 13 emergency. Civilian and non-government milestones: the first civilian in space was Valentina Tereshkova aboard Vostok 6. Tereshkova was only honorarily inducted into the USSR's Air Force, which had no female pilots whatsoever at that time. A month later, Joseph Albert Walker became the first American civilian in space when his X-15 Flight 90 crossed the 100 km line, qualifying him by the international definition of spaceflight. Walker had joined the U.S. Army Air Force but was not a member during his flight. The first people in space who had never been a member of any country's armed forces were both Konstantin Feodosov and Boris Yegorov aboard Voskhod 1. The first non-governmental space traveler was Byron K. Lichtenberg, a researcher from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who flew on STS-9 in 1983. In December 1990, Toyohiro Akiyama became the first paying space traveler as a reporter for Tokyo Broadcasting System, a visit to Mir as part of an estimated $12 million deal with a Japanese TV station, although at the time, the term used to refer to Akiyama was research cosmonaut. Akiyama suffered severe space sickness during his mission, which affected his productivity. The first self-funded space tourist was Denis Tito on board the Russian spacecraft Soyuz Trademark 3 on April 28, 2001. Self-funded travelers. The first person to fly on an entirely privately funded mission was Mike Melville, piloting spaceship OWN Flight 15P on a suborbital journey. Although he was a test pilot employed by Scaled Composites and not an actual paying space tourist, 7 others have paid the Russian Space Agency to fly into space. Denis Tito, April 28 – May 6, 2001. Mark Shuttleworth, April 25 – May 5, 2002. Gregory Olson, October 1 to 11, 2005. And Usher Ansari, September 18 to 29, 2006. Charles Simon Yee, April 7 to 21, 2007, March 26, April 8, 2009. Richard Garriott, October 12 to 24, 2008. Guy La Liberté, September 30, 2009, October 11, 2009. Training. The first NASA astronauts were selected for training in 1959. Early in the space program, military jet test piloting and engineering training were often cited as prerequisites for selection as an astronaut at NASA. Although neither John Glenn nor Scott Carpenter had any university degree in engineering or any other discipline at the time of their selection, selection was initially limited to military pilots. The earliest astronauts for both America and the USSR tended to be jet fighter pilots, and were often test pilots. Once selected, NASA astronauts go through 20 months of training in a variety of areas, including training for extravehicular activity in a facility such as NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory. Astronauts in training may also experience short periods of weightlessness in aircraft called the vomit comet, the nickname given to a pair of modified KC-135s which perform parabolic flights. Astronauts are also required to accumulate a number of flight hours in high-performance jet aircraft. This is mostly done in T-38 jet aircraft out of Ellington Field due to its proximity to the Johnson Space Center. Ellington Field is also where the shuttle training aircraft is maintained and developed, although most flights of the aircraft are done out of Edwards Air Force Base. NASA candidacy requirements: be citizens of the United States, pass a strict physical examination, and have a near and distant visual acuity correctable to 20/20. Blood pressure, while sitting, must be no greater than 140/90. Commander and pilot. A bachelor's degree in engineering, biological science, physical science or mathematics is required. At least 1,000 hours flying time as pilot in command in jet aircraft. Experience as a test pilot is desirable. Height must be 5 feet 2 in to 6 feet 2 in. Distant visual acuity must be correctable to 20/20 in each eye. The refractive surgical procedures of the eye, PARC and LASIK, are now allowed, providing at least 1 year has passed since the date of the procedure with no permanent adverse after effects. For those applicants under final consideration, an operative report on the surgical procedure will be requested. Mission specialist. A bachelor's degree in engineering, biological science, physical science or mathematics, as well as at least 3 years of related professional experience and an advanced degree, such as a master's degree or a doctoral degree. Applicant's height must be between 4 feet 10.5 in and 6 feet 4 in. Mission specialist educator. Applicants must have a bachelor's degree with teaching experience. including work at the kindergarten through 12th grade level. An advanced degree, such as a master's degree or a doctoral degree, is not required, but is strongly desired. Mission specialist educators, or educator astronauts, were first selected in 2004, and as of 2007, there are 3 NASA educator astronauts: Joseph M. Akaba, Richard R. Arnold, and Dorothy Metcalf Lindenberger. Barbara Morgan, selected as backup teacher to Christa McAuliffe in 1985, is considered to be the first educator astronaut by the media, but she trained as a mission specialist. The Educator Astronaut program is a successor to the Teacher in Space program from the 1980s. Health risks of space travel. Astronauts are susceptible to a variety of health risks including decompression sickness, barotrauma, immunodeficiencies, loss of bone and muscle, loss of eyesight, orthostatic intolerance, sleep disturbances, and radiation injury. A variety of large-scale medical studies are being conducted in space via the National Space and Biomedical Research Institute to address these issues. Prominent among these is the Advanced Diagnostic Ultrasound in Microgravity study, in which astronauts perform ultrasound scans under the guidance of remote experts to diagnose and potentially treat hundreds of medical conditions in space. This study's techniques are now being applied to cover professional and Olympic sports injuries, as well as ultrasound performed by non-expert operators in medical and high school students. It is anticipated that remote-guided ultrasound will have application on Earth in emergency and rural care situations, where access to a trained physician is often rare. On December 31, 2012, a NASA-supported study reported that manned spaceflight may harm the brain and accelerate the onset of Alzheimer's disease. Food and drink. An astronaut on the International Space Station requires about 0.83 kilograms weight of food inclusive of food packaging per meal each day. Longer duration missions require more food. Shuttle astronauts worked with nutritionists to select menus that appeal to their individual tastes. 5 months before flight, menus are selected and analyzed for nutritional content by the shuttle dietitian. Foods are tested to see how they will react in a reduced gravity environment. Caloric requirements are determined using a basal energy expenditure formula. On Earth, the average American uses about 35 gallons of water every day. On board the ISS, astronauts limit water use to only about 3 gallons per day. Insignia. In Russia, cosmonauts are awarded Pilot Cosmonaut of the Russian Federation upon completion of their missions, often accompanied with the award of Hero of the Russian Federation. This follows the practice established in the USSR, where cosmonauts were usually awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. At NASA, those who complete astronaut candidate training receive a silver lapel pin. Once they have flown in space, they receive a gold pin. U.S. astronauts who also have active duty military status receive a special qualification badge, known as the Astronaut Badge, after participation on a space flight. The United States Air Force also presents an astronaut badge to its pilots who exceed 50 miles in altitude.